Hello and welcome to Coup Save America. Today we are peeling back the layers of the myth, the illusion, and the outright lie of American democracy. Friends, the stark truth is that the Democratic Party is every bit as morally bankrupt as the Republican Party. Both parties parade around in theatrical opposition, each accusing the other of betraying the public interest. Yet beneath their staged conflict lies a shared allegiance. They both serve one master, and it isn't you, me, or the average American worker struggling to pay rent, affordable health care, or put food on the table. The true master is an invisible but immensely powerful global ruling elite, a network of billionaire donors, multinational corporations, and financial institutions whose vast resources and influence have infiltrated and corrupted nearly every level of our government, from local councils to the halls of Congress, and of course, the White House itself. This corrupting influence isn't subtle or hidden. It operates openly and brazenly through legalized bribery, disguised as campaign contributions. Massive corporations and wealthy individuals pour billions into election cycles to ensure their interests remain a priority, effectively drowning out the voices of ordinary citizens. Policies are routinely written, modified, and implemented to satisfy the demands of these elite interests, often to the direct detriment of public well-being. While average Americans struggle with stagnant wages, mounting debts, and unaffordable housing, corporate profits and executive bonuses continue to reach unprecedented heights. In essence, our so-called democracy has become an auction house, where policy is sold to the highest bidder, and the will of the people is ignored or actively undermined. The evidence of this bipartisan corruption is blatant and overwhelming. Whether it's deregulating financial institutions, leading to catastrophic economic collapses, accelerating climate disaster by providing enormous subsidies to polluting industries, or maintaining a perpetual state of warfare to benefit the defense industry. Both major parties repeatedly align with corporate interest. They maintain a system that enriches the elite at the expense of the working class, ensuring the economic and political power remains firmly concentrated in the hands of a select few. As a result, our supposed democracy is little more than a facade, an elaborate performance designed to distract us from the systemic exploitation and injustice embedded deep within our political system. Let's be quite clear. The United States is uniquely cruel among so-called developed nations, a country profoundly indifferent, maybe even hostile to the basic needs and dignity of its citizens. Consider for just a moment the sobering reality that we stand utterly alone, shamefully alone, among advanced democracies in denying our citizens essential human rights, such as universal health care. While every other developed nation recognizes health care as a fundamental human right, accessible to all irrespective of income, we in America have turned the very concept of universal care into a political weapon, labeling basic compassion as radical socialism. Look around the globe and you'll find universal health care as the norm, not the exception. Countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Australia, and virtually every other industrialized nation provides comprehensive health care to all its citizens without the crippling burden of personal debt. The United Kingdom's National Health Service, the NHS, ensures that health care is available free at the point of use, while Canadians can access medical treatment without fear of bankruptcy. In contrast, nearly 27 million Americans remain uninsured, facing the constant threat of financial ruin should they become ill or injured. Another 41 million are underinsured, holding policies that fail to cover essential medical treatments adequately, leading to deferred medical care and increased morbidity rates. The outcome of our cruel healthcare system are painfully evident. Despite being the wealthiest nation on earth, the U.S. ranks 33rd globally in life expectancy, trailing behind nations with significantly fewer resources. The maternal mortality rate in the United States is among the worst in developed countries, with roughly 32 deaths per 100,000 live births, a rate significantly higher than comparable nations. Furthermore, our infant mortality rate stands at around 5.4 deaths per 1,000 live births, a disgracefully high figure for a country of such immense wealth. Rather than addressing these urgent health crises, American politicians weaponize the issue, branding genuine efforts to implement universal health care as dangerous socialism or unrealistic radicalism. Powerful pharmaceutical companies, hospital conglomerates, and insurance corporations invest hundreds of millions annually in lobbying and political contributions precisely to prevent any meaningful healthcare reform. As a result, our political landscape treats healthcare not as a human right, but as a profitable market commodity, deliberately keeping millions in poverty, fear, and sickness. Furthermore, in a nation of staggering wealth, we continue to deny a living wage to millions of hardworking people who are forced to juggle multiple jobs, sacrificing their health, mental well-being, and precious family time, merely to survive. In fact, the federal minimum wage in the United States remains at an appalling $7.25 per hour, unchanged since 2009, despite the soaring cost of living. Adjusted for inflation, this wage is significantly lower today than in previous decades, forcing nearly 40 million Americans into poverty or near poverty conditions, according to the Economic Policy Institute. Contrary to the claims of corporate lobbyists and certain politicians, raising wages would not cripple businesses or damage the economy. Studies repeatedly show that increasing the minimum wage stimulates consumer spending, reduces employee turnover, and boosts overall economic health. Yet, despite overwhelming public support, nearly two-thirds of Americans favor a federal minimum wage increase to at least $15 per hour, legislative efforts are constantly blocked by powerful corporate lobbying groups and partisan obstruction in Congress. Affordable education, another critical pillar of a thriving modern society, has become an increasingly unattainable luxury in the United States. Student loan debt has spiraled to over $1.7 trillion, surpassing credit card debt and auto loans, becoming the second largest category of consumer debt. This staggering burden impacts over 45 million Americans, disproportionately affecting communities of color and perpetuating generational cycles of poverty. The cost of higher education has increased nearly 8 times faster than wages over the past 4 decades, further widening the wealth and opportunity gaps. On the contrary, countries like Germany, Norway, Sweden, and France have made public higher education tuition-free or significantly subsidized, recognizing education as a public good rather than a financial product for private profit. Paid family leave, a fundamental and practical provision that guarantees parents and caregivers the ability to support loved ones without the looming threat of financial ruin, is a standard right in virtually every other industrialized nation. But again, not in the United States. Only 23% of U.S. workers have access to paid family leave through their employers, leaving millions forced to make impossible choices between their job security and caring for newborns, sick family members, or their own health crises. In stark contrast, countries like Canada, Australia, and those across the European Union mandate extensive paid leave provisions, understanding the undeniable human and economic benefits of supporting families and caregivers during critical life events. Our nation's refusal to implement these humane and practical measures is not a question of affordability, but an intentional policy choice. It is a deliberate, calculated decision driven by corporate interests and their political enablers, prioritizing short-term profit margins and shareholder dividends over basic human dignity, public health, and of course, quality of life. This systemic cruelty is not incidental, it is foundational, reflecting a core belief among the powerful that the welfare of the majority is expendable in the relentless pursuit of wealth and privilege. This systemic cruelty is neither accidental nor isolated. It is deeply entrenched in a bipartisan consensus that spans decades of American politics. Both major political parties actively collaborate to maintain a status quo in which corporate interests dictate policy, ensuring that corporate profits always supersede public well-being. This is evident in policies enacted from administrations from both sides, where deregulation, privatization, and austerity measures have become the default, despite overwhelming evidence of their harmful consequences. For instance, both Republicans and Democrats have presided over significant rollbacks of financial regulations, leading directly to the catastrophic events such as the 2008 financial crisis. That economic collapse wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth for ordinary citizens, causing millions of families to lose their homes, savings, and livelihoods. However, instead of holding Wall Street accountable, the bipartisan consensus delivered massive taxpayer-funded bailouts to the same institutions that created the crises, ensuring that executives continued receiving enormous bonuses even as millions of Americans face financial ruin. Environmental protection is another powerful example of bipartisan complicity. Both parties have permitted oil, coal, and gas industries to continue receiving billions of dollars annually in subsidies, despite overwhelming scientific consensus on the catastrophic effects of fossil fuel emissions on global warming. Rather than taking decisive action to mitigate environmental disasters, both political parties have consistently sided with powerful corporate lobbyists. These industries, in return, pour hundreds of millions into campaign coffers, effectively buying policies that prioritize short-term profit over long-term planetary health. Consequently, communities nationwide experience escalating wildfires, catastrophic hurricanes, and devastating floods, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable and marginalized populations. In terms of labor rights, both parties have historically resisted meaningful protections for workers, favoring corporations' desires for low wages, limited benefits, and precarious employment conditions. Labor unions, once a powerful force advocating for workers' rights, have been systematically undermined by bipartisan legislation efforts, like right-to-work laws and restrictive organizing regulations. Today, union membership stands at an all-time low of just over 10% of the workforce, significantly weakening workers' collective bargaining power and exacerbating wage stagnation and inequality. Similarly, both Democrats and Republicans have constantly prioritized a military-industrial complex, ensuring a perpetual state of warfare that enriches defense contractors while neglecting domestic social needs. Despite public opinion strongly favoring reduced military spending and increased investment in healthcare, education, and infrastructure, defense budgets routinely increase regardless of the party in power. The 2023 U.S. military budget exceeded $858 billion, more than the next 10 highest spending nations combined, even as millions of Americans face poverty, homelessness, and inadequate health care. The deliberate sabotage of meaningful social reforms by both Democrats and Republicans reveals their fundamental allegiance not to the voters who elect them, but to the powerful corporations and billionaires who finance their campaigns. As long as profit remains paramount, basic human rights will remain negotiable, and millions will continue to suffer unnecessarily under America's uniquely brutal system. Both major political parties have been systematically corrupted through legalized bribes, cynically renamed as campaign contributions. In the 2022 midterm elections alone, political spending soared to an unprecedented $16.7 billion, highlighting the grotesque influence money holds over our elections. It's a racket, plain and simple. A government openly bought and paid for, shamelessly dismissing the notion of serving we, the people. Our representatives, quite simply, do not represent the common citizen. They are marionettes dancing to the tune of powerful corporate interest. The pharmaceutical industry spent over $372 million on lobbying efforts in 2022 alone, securing policies that keep drug prices astronomically high and prevent genuine healthcare reform. Defense contractors, another massive influence, poured approximately $101 million into lobbying efforts the same year, ensuring endless wars and inflated defense budgets continue unabated, despite overwhelming public opposition to perpetual military conflict. Wall Street, the notorious epicenter of economic power, spent over $330 million in lobbying in 2022, consistently blocking meaningful financial reform and consumer protections, further enriching the wealthy at the expense of average Americans. Fossil fuel giants funneled more than $124 million into lobbying to obstruct climate action and environmental protections, deliberately sabotaging our planet's future to maintain their short-term profits. Additionally, powerful entities like the Israeli lobby, particularly groups such as AIPAC, annually spend tens of millions of dollars to ensure unwavering American support for controversial Israeli policies, regardless of human rights abuses or international law violations. These interests have not only bought Congress, but have systematically infiltrated and corrupted every regulatory agency designed to protect us. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, and even the Federal Communications Commission have been captured by industry insiders who ensure regulatory oversight is minimal at best and actively harmful at worst. Former executives from the very corporations these agencies are meant to regulate routinely hold positions of authority within the regulatory organizations, creating an endless revolving door between government and corporate boardrooms. This systemic corruption perpetuates harm, undermines democracy, and makes a mockery of the concept of government by and for the people. Understand this. The United States is not now, nor has it ever truly been, a democracy. Even the label of a representative republic barely holds water under historical scrutiny. The oft-celebrated founding fathers intentionally designed a system of governance inherently skewed toward the wealthy elite, reserving political power exclusively for white, male landowners. At the nation's inception, only about 6% of the population had the right to vote, effectively silencing the vast majority of the populace, not to mention women, indigenous peoples, African slaves, and even white men without property. This wasn't accidental oversight. It was intentional structural exclusion aimed at safeguarding the economic and political power of the ruling elite. These revered founding fathers were not benign visionaries championing liberty for all. Rather, they were in essence the top 1% of their day. Men such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison owned hundreds of slaves, and their substantial fortunes were directly built on the brutal exploitation and forced labor of enslaved Africans. Jefferson himself enslaved over 600 individuals throughout his lifetime. The legacy of their design is not one of freedom, but of systemic oppression, entrenched racism, and institutionalized inequality, an enduring system that continues to perpetuate massive disparities today. America's mythologized greatness masks a dark and brutal history. This country was built upon genocide and land theft from indigenous peoples, with an estimated 10 to 15 million Native Americans perishing due to violence, disease, and forced displacement by the U.S. government from the 15th to the 19th centuries. From its inception, the United States has repeatedly pursued imperialistic policies abroad, leading to perpetual states of war and military conflict. Historically, out of its nearly 250 years of existence, America has been at war for more than 220 years, making peace an exceptionally rare occurrence. Today, this oppressive legacy is sustained by overt actions such as U.S. support for dictatorial regimes. We funnel billions of dollars annually into Israel, for instance, which international human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have accused of committing war crimes, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people. The U.S. has provided Israel with over $146 billion in aid since 1948, much of which funds military operations that disproportionately harm Palestinian civilians. In Gaza alone, the UN has documented thousands of civilian deaths resulting from Israeli military campaigns funded by America. Likewise, our government blatantly neglects pressing domestic crises, while eagerly approving massive military aid and tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit billionaires and multinational corporations, such as the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which provided over $1.5 trillion in cuts, largely favoring the wealthiest 1%. American families face increasing poverty and insecurity. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 38 million Americans live in poverty, and over 11 million children are classified as food insecure. Meanwhile, a recent Credit Karma survey revealed that 63% of American parents struggled, and often failed, to afford basic back-to-school necessities for their children this year. These statistics expose the grotesque priorities of a government more invested in enriching elites and perpetuating global conflicts than supporting its own citizens. And Don't be fooled by the comforting rhetoric that America is simply broken or off track. The truth is far more disturbing. America was engineered to operate exactly like this, a system built upon deliberate exploitation and engineered inequality. From its earliest days, the nation's economic and political structures were carefully crafted to extract cheap labor, seize natural resources, and consolidate wealth into the hands of a privileged few, whether through chattel slavery, land theft, indentured servitude, or wage suppression. The wealth of the elite was built on the backs of millions. What we label as systemic failures, be it growing homelessness, rising poverty, unaffordable health care, crumbling public education, are not anomalies. They are symptoms of a system performing exactly as designed, prioritizing profit over people, wealth over welfare, expansion over justice. The United States government has always put profits above people, always sacrificed justice for wealth, always chosen war and exploitation over peace and cooperation. If we're ever to save America, and I mean truly save it, we must first see clearly what it has always been: a cruel, oppressive empire serving an elite class whose prosperity is built on our collective suffering. It's time to wake up, rise up, and take back our power. Because until we fundamentally dismantle this corrupt and morally bankrupt system, real democracy and real justice will forever remain out of reach. And that, my friends, is the final word up front. Today, we are joined by an amazing author, Paul Greenberg, who is here to talk about his latest book titled A Third Term. In this work of satirical fiction, Paul explores what might happen if a sitting president were to finagle an extra 4 years from the American people. And could this problem be solved by resurrecting George Washington and bringing him into the 21st century? A third term focuses on issues of character. What does it take to lead? And what do we sacrifice when we choose public service over the private sector? Paul and I will speculate upon these questions and much more right after the break. We'll be right back. Paul Greenberg is the author of 7 books on food, climate, and politics, including the New York Times bestseller, Four Fish, and more recently, A Third Term. A regular contributor to the Times and a frequent guest on national television and radio, Mr. Greenberg lectures widely in institutions ranging from TED to Google and dozens of universities nationwide. He currently teaches at New York University's Animal Studies program and lives at Ground Zero in Manhattan, where he produces, at least to his knowledge, the only wine grown south of 14th Street. And Mr. Greenberg joins us right now. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Thanks for having me on the show, Sean.
Hey, thank you for coming on. I'll be honest, I don't normally read fiction.
But I don't normally write it.
But I found your book fascinating. I really enjoyed it. It's actually a relatively short book. Yep. But it does bring about a lot of interesting questions. And given that you just acknowledge that you don't normally write fiction, I'm just curious, what compelled you to choose speculative fiction to explore the idea of a Trump third term?
It's a good question. I did start out writing fiction at the beginning of my career. But for the longest time, I've been writing environmental fiction. The environment has been something since childhood I've really cared about. I actually grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, the center of the plutocracy, but I always say we rented, we didn't own. So we always lived in like the liveryman's cottage. But my mother always put us on these giant estates where I could basically roam free and poach other people's fish. So it was always a very close issue to my heart. I always knew that I wanted to write about the environment and to protect the environment and to be behind the environmental movement. But after having bestsellers and being on pretty much every radio and TV show I could be on, at a certain point I realized that you can talk all you want about sort of the micro world of the environmental movement, but as you said, in your opener, which I thought was great, if there's no politics to support that environmental movement, then what's the point? It's just more theater, as you might say. So this time around, I really just decided to kind of take aim at the politics themselves. I think I'm blanking on the person who said it, that politics is the entertainment wing of the military-industrial complex, and it might have been Noam Chomsky, I can't remember. But in any case, I have increasingly found the theater of politics to be disgusting. And we've ended up with the ultimate theatrical president who won and wins because he's mastered the theatrical. So, believe it or not, I actually conceived of this book 4 years ago during the 2020 campaign, and back then it seemed like Biden might lose, and then Trump would win, and then he would run again. Then Biden won. I couldn't actually sell this book at the time. Nobody wanted it. The idea of bringing Washington back from the past, it was right in the middle of the Black Lives Matters movement. And so nobody really wanted to hear about who George Washington was as a person or whatever. And I put it in a drawer and I forgot about it. And then the machinations of 2024 began. And a funder came to me who'd read the book in draft form, said, why don't we publish this thing? So we did. And made some tweaks to adjust for, some strange anomalies of history. I almost actually just reissued an edition where, in the 2028 Democratic National Convention, they wheel out Jimmy Carter, to kind of like rattle the cage. But of course, he died in the intervening years. But then I did a revision where, in fact, he didn't die. It turns out he didn't want to die under a Republican administration, and so they put him into a secret hospice, and then they wheel him out at whatever 104, and he gives the opening speech, and no one can even understand what he's saying. So, it was meant to be kind of metaphor to the whole thing. Anyway, it's a long answer to your question. I just, in short, felt that I needed to address the politics directly and satirically, and this seemed to be the best way to do it.
Why do you think that satire and political fiction can allow us to kind of confront truths that nonfiction sometimes cannot?
Well, I mean, and again, this goes back to my experience as a journalist. Journalism has to kind of function within these kind of rules, which I think probably you would argue are part of the construct of the thing that keeps us in our box. And satire doesn't, and fiction doesn't, and it doesn't really have any rules. And I would say this is true of all fiction, not just satirical fiction. But I think it's we've gotten to the point where the truest things that are said today are said by comedians.
Yes.
It's no surprise that Jon Stewart hoed his row mocking the news as if he were the news. And I think a lot of Americans now take his word a lot more literally than they do the construct of corporate news. So I just think, we need a way around these formats and formulas. I was actually, back in the day, I was a semiotics student at Brown University. And, I think it was Roland Barthes who said something like that, stories and the news and so forth are kind of myths of bourgeois pleasure, and they're designed specifically to delude us. So, to try and puncture that bubble, that's what semiotics is. And that's sort of what I was trying to do with this book.
Well, you did a great job. I loved the book. And can we put the cover up, Mackenzie? A third term.
And the cover is actually an interesting story. So I don't know if you recognize the art, but it's by Barry Blitt, who does a lot of the Trump covers in the New Yorker magazine. And
really?
Yeah. And Barry and we'd known each other because I'd written a piece for the Times a number of years ago about Ernest Hemingway. And it was another speculation. It was like, how many fish would there be in the sea if Hemingway had never lived? And then I went back and did a kind of historical regression and talked to NOAA scientists and figured out that there'd be a lot more tuna in marlin if Hemingway never lived. Anyway, Barry did the illustration for that. So I had his email address. And back in 2020, I asked him if he was interested. He was like, no, I'm too busy. But this time around, I think his fire was up and he was like, yes, I am interested. And so he actually did the cover. We went through a lot of iterations with it. And, I think I mentioned he's Canadian. So I think he feels particularly, in the crosshairs of what's going on. But it was, it's great to have him on board. And that was kind of a game changer in terms of the trajectory of this book.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you is throughout the book, you never mentioned Trump by name.
Yeah.
You refer to him as a tyrant. And I'm just wondering, was it a conscious decision or was there another reason for that?
Well, there were many factors going into it. One of them is that, have you noticed? I mean, I don't know if you read the New York Times regularly, but, I always look at it in the morning. And when you look at the headlines now, there'll be 10 headlines and 8 of them will have Trump in the headline. Which is a conscious strategy on the Trump administration's part because, that's the brand. And so right away, I didn't want to say that name anymore. And I felt like by denying it voice, you were working against this force that was trying to keep this forever in the news. The other thing, it works historically too. If you read the founding fathers, they often speak of this theoretical tyrant who might arise. And indeed, in the third term in the book, when Washington is awoken from the past, he turns to the doctors and says, has a tyrant arisen? And they say, yes, as we prefigured. And so it works in that sense. And then, third sense, I don't know. I just like it being anonymous a little bit too. We just produced a radio script of the story that we're hoping to shop, and maybe potentially a film script. You didn't mention in your opening monologue the various ways. One vital institution, which is part of this thing that's keeping us down, that's Hollywood. The stories that Hollywood tells us. I have a Hollywood agent, and I talked to her. I said, is this the time to try and go out with this as a film? And she said, frankly, nobody wants to talk about this in Hollywood, and nobody wants to touch the word Trump. Nobody wants to get involved. Nobody wants to. So I kind of feel like it's potentially good protective coloration. Like if I were to get a George Clooney to pick up the script, and in a dream world play Washington, it wouldn't necessarily have to be pitched as an anti-Trump thing. It was interesting. I was just watching the Jaws 50th anniversary documentary. I don't know if you managed to see that. It's pretty good. But it's interesting because Jaws, remember, I think came out, what was it, like 75, 76. And it was very much in the wake, maybe it was even 77, but it was very much in the wake of Watergate. And I never thought of this before, but remember there's the mayor who doesn't want to acknowledge that there's a shark and he wants to keep the beaches open and, da-da-da-da-da. Well, in the documentary, it's revealed that he's basically a stand-in for Nixon. But you don't have to say Nixon to see that. You know what I mean? So I think let's not just dwell on Trump. Let's dwell on tyranny more than anything else. And the fact that it has been installed in this government.
Would you describe a third term as dystopian, cautionary, absurdist, or maybe all three?
A little bit of all three. Dystopian insofar as it's funny, when I wrote it when I wrote the first draft 4 years ago, I could never have predicted that things would have gone so far as they've gone. And I think, I tried to stay away from actual concrete physical descriptions of the way America looked or what people were talking about, and really keep it among the characters. But the one little glimpse you see is that in 2028, the Democratic National Convention is held in New York. And it's held in New York because it's like the last blue state. And by that point, everything I can't remember I invented something like the Electoral Review Board or something, but there's some body that allows the president to see the election returns before they're public. Right. It's a pact, and a certain number of states have signed on to the pact, but New York hasn't signed on yet. So that struck me as dystopian but we saw New Jersey tilt very far to the right, almost kind of going in that direction. So, and then imagining New York as just being, I live in New York City, imagining New York even worse, from a kind of like litter blowing everywhere. So there's that. I think the satirical part, and the part that's maybe absurdist, is that we all know the famous thing that Trump said, that if he were to shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, nobody would care. Well, this idea that if Washington himself came back to run against Trump, would Trump supporters stand by Trump instead of Washington? And I suppose that's absurdist, but the more we go into this, the more you start to think maybe they would vote for Trump over Washington. And so it's kind of like it's not a shoo-in, and it's a neck and neck kind of race, which is meant also to sort of satirize the ridiculousness of the way we run elections. You mentioned at the top of the hour, the amount of money that we're pouring into it, and it's just this ridiculous popularity contest that ends up not being about issues. It ends up being entirely about personalities. And there's various feints and jogs that happen to Washington in the course of the campaign that are distractions. Sex gets involved, out of touchness gets involved, and all these kind of monikers, and sort of sound bites that are used in an election get used against Washington. And so I suppose that's the biggest fun that I'm poking, is that this ridiculous kind of Pepsi versus Coke election system, that is as much like the Super Bowl as it is like, a cola advertisement.
Yeah. And I'm not going to spoil the ending of the book.
No,
but there's a bit of a twist in terms of who actually ends up becoming president.
Yes. And we won't go into it too much, but, and this could, segue us into a discussion, of what you were, it's funny, as I was listening to your opener, I was trying to decide, do I 100% agree with you on the sort of foundational mission of America? Like, was it set up specifically to impoverish, deprive, enrich a few? And let's just say that, Washington has to actually confront that. He actually, in the course of the book, one of my favorite lines in the book is, back in Washington, Washington read Washington. So he ends up reading Ron Chernow's biography of himself, and is shocked that so much that he thought was private is actually available to the public. And he has to confront a number of those issues, one of which results in his vice presidential selection. But again, we'll leave that on ice for the viewers to read later on. But yeah, I was thinking about it when you were doing your monologue. I was like, yes, America, and in general, you could say all of the colonial Americas were set up for that purpose. The difference is, I've spent a lot of time reporting in South America. And one thing that's quite notable about South America is that those countries seem much more set up for extraction rather than, creating a civilization. And I always think about like railways, right? We, say what you will about American trains, but we have them. Whereas if you go to South America, there's very few trains, and most of it is buses and cars and stuff. And you really get the sense that it's a continent that was meant to be kind of tilted up like this, so that everything could slide into the ocean for the boats to take it away. So, and then I was thinking about the founding fathers, and yes, they were slave owners, and yes, they were rich people, and yes, they were obsessed with finery in Europe and so forth. But they did go to the trouble of writing a Declaration of Independence. They did go to the trouble of writing the Federalist Papers, all of these kinds of things. So it's a pretty tall order to say that they set out to deceive everybody. I think they were children of the Enlightenment. I think they had a core of some kind of better idea of the world. And I think that they very much operated at cross purposes to themselves. Like many people, like an author friend of mine named Sean Woolsey, who I really respect, he's been arguing lately that hypocrisy is probably the most human trait that we have. And to nail everybody on their Hippocratic thing, like we're doing with Mamdani and his, $2,000 apartment in New York, shocked. Oh God. We're all complicated multi-layered beings. And again, that was probably another thing I wanted to do. It was fun for me to explore Washington not as the guy on the quarter and the dollar, but as somebody who is at cross purposes with himself. And I will actually take my hat off to Ron Chernow. His biography of Washington is it's a great read, and I learned tons about Washington as a slave owner, as all these kind of conflicted kind of things. So anyway, what was the original question? I've wandered.
That's okay. No, the original question was whether or not you would describe the novel as kind of dystopian,
Oh,
caution,
right. Yeah. Yeah, no, and then we were talking about the eventual the vice presidential pick that gets inserted into the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, you know, there's so many layers there. I don't know if you ever saw Hamilton, the musical.
Yes.
And for me, like I'm 58. My son grew up with that musical, and so like it was like the soundtrack of every commute to a soccer game was listening to it. So you get the sense that like Hamilton was great, and he was opposed to slavery, and 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 that comes from Chernow as well. I mean, Chernow wrote the biography upon which the musical was based, and you have both in the Chernow Washington and the Chernow Hamilton biographies moments where like Lafayette goes down, I think, to South America and starts a plantation, buys a plantation, and frees all the slaves, and writes to Washington, saying, it's really working. I've got the cinnamon plantation. They freed the slaves. It really, really worked. It's really working. And Washington's just not writing back at all. So I think that the word lacuna, from Freud, I think is really the functional word here. Is that I think all of these founding fathers, I don't think they thought of themselves as rapacious, evil people. I think they had these Enlightenment ideas in their heads, and then no emotional or moral way to guide themselves towards the full enactment of these principles that they had kind of high in their minds. And I don't know, it'd be interesting. I mean, truly, it would be great to be able to go back in time and talk to these people, but obviously all we have are their records.
Do you think that the founding fathers, what do you think their impression of America today would be?
Well, it's interesting. So, what's interesting about this book is that I have been invited on so many different kinds of podcasts across the political spectrum. So I've been on libertarian podcasts, I've been on MAGA podcasts, and interestingly, they all kind of like the book. It's been a fun ride. But what the libertarians were saying is that Washington would hate the nation that we've got right now because it's just all full of rules and regulations, and you can't just hack into the frontier and set up your tent and do whatever it is that you want. So I think they're kind of right. Like I think it would baffle them that this monstrosity of a government has arisen that does so many things, and, they would have had, in order for them to understand it, I mean, they would have to read about the syndicalist movement. They would have to read, there's so much background they would have to understand. So I think they would mostly just see a trammeled, as I think it was Peter Matheson said, a country gone gray before its time. Just obliterated on so many different levels. I think they would be shocked by the multiracial quality of it. I think they did conceive of the nation as a white nation. But, at the same time, they were flexible thinkers, at least on the page. And, I think, it was Jefferson, right, who said that we should have a regular revolution, to kind of stir things up. Whether he would have stood by that or not, we don't know. But I think they would have been fascinated. I think they would have, it's a little bit like, that science fiction story where the butterfly, you have to walk along the ribbon, in the past, and somebody, I don't know, steps off and upsets a butterfly, and then it ends up with an entire different universe. So I think they would have been fascinated by what they laid down, kind of going forward, has what it's become. I mean, do any of us really think that we're going to have an effect on the future? I mean, maybe extremely egocentric people do. And probably they'd be pretty darn impressed that, people even still remembered them. I mean, I feel that about myself. I mean, I obviously I'm not on that level, but so I think, I don't know. I mean, one fun bit of the book that I liked. Since I just did this new edition, I had to read it carefully and copy edit and so forth. But that that the tyrant character just becomes obsessed with how often you see Washington's name or his image on the money, to the point where the tyrant even thinks that he even tries to see if he can issue the Harriet Tubman quarter,
Right.
to get rid of Washington's face. So I think they would have been interested. I mean, there's also, these were people raised in the Old and New Testament, and they probably would have thought something about graven images and whether or not their faces and names and should be preserved in that kind of stature. But it's a certainly interesting thing to contemplate.
Yeah, no. What do you think that and you did a good job of addressing this in the book, I think, but for our listeners, what do you think Washington's take on Trump would be? Do you think that he would actually be appalled by Trump? Do you think he would consider him a tyrant?
Well, so there's a moment right after Washington is woken from the past, and Robert Tonnelly is a sort of kind of David Axelrod type person who's his campaign manager, and Washington says, "I should like to know the character of your tyrant," and Tonnelly puts down a book on his hospital table, and he says, "I think this might give you an impression of what he thinks of himself," and he picks it up. And Washington says, "So your tyrant considers himself an artist of deals, does he?" And he goes, very coarse indeed, but well titled." So I think Washington would have been impressed by his political acumen and his ability to spin things. But the main issue of the book, and the main sort of pivot around which the book rotates, is this question of character. The fact Washington in the book, and I think in real life, would take issue with Trump's evasion of military service, and the bone spurs. The bone spurs come up in the book, and I think there's a whole. It's interesting because, like, when I was on a MAGA podcast, I said, I mentioned in the French and Indian War, there was a moment when Washington led his troops into battle against the French, literally at point blank range, and many of his troops were mowed down, and he came back with musket holes in his tunic, but unscathed. And I said, on this MAGA podcast, I couldn't see Trump running headlong into musket fire. And the response was, "Well, no, but he was there when they shot him, and they shot his ear." And I was like, there's a big difference between just happening to be somewhere and getting shot and choosing to run into a bullet. So I mean, I think that's interesting. And I actually had a really fascinating podcast conversation with a vet, and he'd been in so many wars. He'd been in Bosnia, and I had actually worked in Bosnia back right after the war ended. I used to work for a nonprofit that did media development, USAID funded media democratization after, in post-war and post-dictatorship situation. So I'd worked in Russia quite a bit. I speak Russian, and then I went to Bosnia. Really? Yeah. I worked in Russia from about 1990 to 96 on and off, where I was the director of media training. So right after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were about 300 little TV stations, pirate TV stations, that came into being, and they wanted to become full-fledged media institutions. So the nonprofit I worked with was called Internews. We went in and would give these TV stations equipment, and we would bring journalists over and teach them how to do local news. And, it was very cutting edge, weird stuff. Bosnia, I went in just after the war ended in 96, and it was part of a reconstruction effort to try and get Serbs and Croats and Bosnian Muslims to work all together on unified programming. Because you'll remember from that war that the thing that caused the war really was the fact that there was Croatian TV and Serbian TV and Bosnian TV, and they were all saying different things. Anyway, I was on this podcast with this vet who I think probably voted Republican. I'm not sure. I don't want to, speculate. But his main issue was all the entanglements that we've gotten into year after year after year, and Bosnia, Iraq, Iraq again, Kuwait, and he had borne the brunt on his own shoulders of these irrational overcommitments that we'd done. And what he really took issue with, he's like, and it was interesting because, in this podcast world, right, it runs the gamut, right? There's people, literally a guy in a basement with a microphone. And then there's a, podcast like yours that's professionally produced and has interesting graphics, But this guy was just a guy, he was a basement guy sitting there, but very well spoken and very compassionate. And he was just like, I don't want us getting entangled anymore. And he had made a study of presidents who had served in the military and presidents who had not served in the military. And interestingly, those who had served in the military, in his opinion anyway, were much more careful before getting us involved because they knew what the heck was going to happen once we did this. And here we have the ultimate non-military man, sticking our thumbs in so many different places. And, gosh, we're only 6 or 7 months into this, so who knows where we're headed.
And he campaigned as a non-interventionist too.
Right, because he knew. I mean, you can say what you will about the Trump people, but they did their homework. They knew who they were talking to, and that's it's an interesting split, right? Because there's this whole group of people that are military. They might vote Republican normally, but they don't want any more intervention. So you have a Republican coming along and says, "Okay, we're not going to intervene at all." So these little shavings of pieces of the electorate that the Trump people did was very cleverly done.
Well, Trump is a master manipulator, but he's also a master communicator. And I don't think people give him enough credit for that. I mean, he's very good at crafting a message. Now, people on the left don't necessarily get the message.
Right.
But I can certainly see that there's a message there. And that, I mean, he basically ran as a populist.
Yes. And I think, it is true. And it's funny. I don't know if you've ever done this as a thought exercise, but just to sit down and just listen to Trump, without, take your filter off and just see, is he talking to you? And he does. And, I always say, to me, and you may not share this. I mean, at the top, you were saying it's just, Democrats and Republicans are the same kind of bullshitters. And, part of me very much agrees with you, but I also don't want a third term of Trump. But I often go back and think about the person who could have taken Trump out is Al Franken. And the reason being that Al Franken came from the media. He understands how television works. He understands how humor works. And I think it's, I don't know if you read that long New Yorker investigation of the Me Too moment that happened with Franken that basically knocked him out of the race. But there's a lot of evidence of sort of Republican frame up, because I think deep within the Republican establishment, they realized that this Franken guy was trouble and he could take people out. I so regret, and I'm so disappointed with Kirsten Gillibrand that she immediately jumped on that Me Too thing and knocked him out of the race. When you think about the amount of, listen, I don't want to get into a whole Me Too debate and whatever, but what Al Franken did compared to some of the things that other men have done is just, it's just not, it's not in the same league. And if we'd been able to preserve his political career, I think we would be in a very different place.
Well, so often these movements, Me Too and so forth, get co-opted.
Yep.
And I think that's what happened with Me Too. On a very similar note, we had the whole Epstein files controversy.
Yes.
And it seems hypocritical because, wait a minute, MAGA is really in a fury about these Epstein files, and so are Democrats, rightfully so.
Yeah.
But not quite in the same way that MAGA is. I mean, MAGA is really dedicated to this.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, well, you selected Trump. Why is this the issue for you that is so important? I mean, it almost seems hypocritical, and it kind of is.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Adam Gopnik years ago did something about Clinton and the Lewinsky fear,
Right.
the Lewinsky situation. And the title of the piece was "C'est la lie." And so it's not the sex that's the issue, it's the lie. And you know, we are not part of the media ecosystem that feeds the MAGA movement. So we don't fully, I think, see the parameters that people who are in that ecosystem are guided by. But I think if I can speculate based on the podcasts I've been on and based on the people I've spoken with, I think a big cardinal direction of the MAGA movement is that this is the truth. The truth is being revealed. Like we're peeling off the layers of the onion, and we're revealing the deep state, et cetera, et cetera. And so to then have the Trump administration give the impression that they're actually part of the onion, putting more layers back onto the onion,
Right.
that to them is more disturbing than any kind of sexual imbroglio that might be the case. So, will it ever take him down? I don't know. I mean, I like you. I'm like, fan the flames. Let's see where it goes. The whole thing's very mysterious and weird. At the time when he hung himself in prison, I found that very weird. It didn't seem to add up. I actually know, prison guards, and didn't really think that. I fished with a former prison guard. And, he's like, I don't see how that could happen per se. But anyway, I don't want to go down that road too deeply. But have you had anyone on the show to talk about that directly?
No, I have not yet. No, I've been kind of avoiding that.
Yeah,
to be quite honest with you, because there's so many. It's a rabbit hole for sure.
it is for sure.
And it's just, in some ways too, it's a distraction.
Yeah. And the thing is about this administration, every layer and every sphere of the administration puts a distraction on top of what's actually going on. Like, I have a very dear friend from high school who I suspect voted for Trump or didn't vote because her husband is very pro-gun and so forth. But where she's at is she's very anti-vax. She's very, Waldorf school type kind of, liberal education, not liberal education in the classic sense, but like off the grid education. And, if she didn't vote for Biden or did vote for Trump, I'm certain it's because of RFK. And for, again, the theater that RFK is creating around healthcare, around health, around fitness, and all these kinds of things. Like those people, that little shaved off piece of the electorate thought that this would actually get dealt with. But RFK, like Trump, is another showman, and and is doing the show per the direction of Trump, or per its own internal weird direction. But the thing about egomaniacs, which I think RFK is probably one.
Oh, definitely.
That egomaniacs like to keep the conversation about themselves. My father was, a psychiatrist, and he always talked about narcissists. He was very obsessed with narcissists, and what narcissists like to talk about is themselves. And in a way, you have these little orbiting planets talking about themselves, when, as you said at the top of the show, what we really need to talk about are us, about the people, and the actual issues that matter to us.
Yeah, I mean, this whole situation that we're in right now is, on the one hand, it's almost humorous to look at. I mean, it's very satirical in a sense, because if someone had made a movie of this, of what we're going through right now, I don't think anybody would. It's like, no, that's not even. That's so implausible that it's not even entertaining.
Yeah.
And yet it's also very dystopian, and it's very frightening.
Yep. And so go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, it's just so many people also voting against and working against their own interests. You have immigrants with tenuous legal status voting for Trump. You have African Americans voting for Trump. And it's like, I think that there's this identification with success that's going on that is, again, making this absurdist thing that, as you say, it's hard to make this shit up. But this wanting to ally with what's at the center of things. And, now we even see it with our European allies,
Oh yeah.
um, inclining in this direction, wanting to seem like they're kind of on this kind of winning side of things. If there's one thing that Trump advertises as much as himself, it's the concept of winning. And winning is a really weird thing. It, you can be victorious and a total loser. I think the phrase Pyrrhic victory comes to mind, where you kill Priam, but Troy is leveled and everything you were fighting for is gone. I think that's really very much an operative model at this moment. And again, going back to my book, I mean, one of the reasons I decided to do this is like, what are we talking about anyway? Like, what's at stake here? Like, do we have any core values at all? Like, I'm curious, just in terms of, your opening monologue, like, did you ever in your life subscribe to this American vision of itself? I mean, surely, clearly you were educated and so forth, but like, what was your, how did you come to publicly, have you always been saying these things? Like, what's been your progression?
No, I pretty much have always felt this way.
Yeah.
Just the inherent contradiction. The history that we're taught in school about America is highly mythologized.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that we have to be honest. We have to talk about the horrors of slavery. We have to talk about the horrors of the genocide of the Native people. We have to talk about how this country was founded and admit that we're not perfect.
Yeah.
And it's always disturbed me, this idea of America. I've always been turned off by this idea of greatness, that we're better than in every other country, because that stalls progress. If you instill in people a mindset of greatness, this is perfection, then there's very little incentive to try to improve upon what you have.
Yes, it's true. It's true. And I think, and that's the dilemma that the Democrats find themselves in, right? Because we're the flaw party. We're the party that points out things that are problematic, that needs to be fixed in some kind of uncomfortable way that nobody really wants to actually address. Whereas I think, and again, I do agree with you that there's sort of two sides to the same coin of both parties. But the Republicans, they lead with winning and they lead with brightness and greatness, and then everything else that needs to be fixed is just stuff that's distracting from our already greatness. Which is I think the Democratic position. I've lived quite a bit in Europe. I've lived in France and, as I say, Russia, and it's much more of a continental approach that we are imperfect and that we need to fix things. And a lot of Americans just don't really like to go in that direction. And I think also a lot of immigrants come to this country, and in a kind of very false way, adopt that, you know what I mean? And just say, I had all this trouble back in my old country where I doubted things and I was cynical. I'm just going to embrace this greatness of America. And I think that's, again, another way that the electorate was shaved off. Was, do you want to be with the cynics, or do you want to be with the the great situation? So it's tough going forward.
How did you kind of, in the book? So
yeah,
again, we're on the radio here. We're kind of talking to people who probably haven't read the book yet. Although I would highly recommend people read the book. It's again a third term by Paul Greenberg. How did Trump manage to finagle a third term?
Oh, so yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things I finesse in the book, including the time travel. Like the time travel, there's just an anomaly that occurs that they knew was coming, and they could snatch one person from the past. But I think the premise that I laid out but didn't go too far into is that somehow the Supreme Court rules that that the Constitution meant 2 consecutive terms,
right?
And that there's nothing wrong with doing an interrupted third term. I do think he's going to run for a third term. I absolutely think he's going to run for a third term. And when I keep in mind, as I said, I wrote a draft of this 4 years ago. I had no idea the degree of unconstitutionality that would take place in just these first 6 months of this administration. Even Trump's first term couldn't really prepare you for what's gone down in the last 6 months. But I think you'll agree, the most surprising thing isn't necessarily Trump's behavior. It's the degree to which the so-called liberal establishment has completely just laid down and been steamrolled. Everything from my own university, Brown University, to higher, all measure of academia, government institutions, nonprofits, all these kinds of things have just kind of accepted this kind of thing. So I do think that we're working in kind of half steps towards the point at which either the Supreme Court will rule that it is constitutional for Trump to run for a third term, or they will choose not to take the case, and then defer to some lower court or some bullshit like that. I think the Supreme Court has revealed itself to be partial, and
that's putting it mildly.
But you know what I mean. In leading up to these things, we were always like, oh, maybe John Roberts, maybe like, because remember he had some dust ups with Trump, and maybe he really will hold the line. I don't see any line being held at all. And I have a lawyer friend who's actually the pro-democracy guy. He has an organization called democratism.org. Sort of interesting, he started out his organization. He ran for city council at one point, and he started out with his organization trying to get rid of the electoral college. And, he's working, and now with that kind of, he's still working on that, but he's now working on, how do we empower local governments, local and state governments to kind of create a bulwark against all these things. But he's trained as a lawyer, and he has this kind of faith in the law that I just don't have. And at the end of the day, lawyers, it's so much about who has the most money to pay the most lawyers. And, why Trump got through this series of legal debacles is because somebody somewhere was paying those legal bills. And in the end, the person who was able to spend the most money won, I was just reading, I don't know if you've read it, but Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, about Robert Moses.
No, I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, it came out in the 70s, and the only reason I finally read it is because they reissued it on Kindle. Previously, apparently it was the most pages you could cram into a paperback binding, and so it always fell apart before I could finish it. So finally on Kindle, I don't have that risk. But it's about the rise of Robert Moses, who, remade New York City from a physical point of view, and he starts out as this very kind of progressive liberal guy, part of the progressive movement in the 1910s and 20s, and then gradually is sort of corrupted and transformed by power. And watching that, he wins legal battle after legal battle, because once he's sort of ensconced within the state government of New York, he has endless legal recourse and endless access to law, to lawyers, basically. And so any private citizen who, he plows the Long Island Expressway and the Northern Parkway right through people's houses and estates and farms, and he's able to do it because he just has this army of lawyers that is with bottomless pockets to pay them. So going back to the Trump issue, I think as long as he has as many lawyers as he does and the money to support those lawyers, he'll win.
Yeah.
Here's my pet theory, or here's my pet plan. I would like to make being a lawyer illegal. I would like to basically say you cannot be represented by somebody else. You have to represent yourself, and every person in America has to get a year of legal training, and that's it. And because it's just not fair.
Yeah. I mean, we saw from when Trump first ran during his first campaign, this litany of controversies that he got entangled in, grabbed them by the what.
Yeah.
And you put that with the whole idea of Republicans being the family values and all this nonsense. And I just was sitting back thinking, okay, at any moment, Trump is just going to falter, because, I mean, this is impossible any other candidate would have been toast. And we go right through until his second and third campaign, right? Where I mean, he's been charged with felonies. And not any of it matters.
He's still standing.
Yeah.
No, yeah. Well, and again, because I have such a deep sort of sentimental education in the former Soviet Union. I was a Soviet studies major back in the day, and read a lot of Solzhenitsyn. Just read everything, not everything, but I've read a lot, and I've studied the way autocracies work. And one of the ways that they work is by creating an ideological media bubble around them that presents reality in a hermetic way that cannot be punctured. So, you and I can say this, and say, when are we going to talk about the pussy grabbing and and when are they going to realize all that? If we could put, it would be interesting. This would be an interesting virtual reality experiment. But like, if we could all put on a MAGA goggle set that would allow us only to view MAGA media, I think that would be a very interesting thing, because I think you wouldn't even see it. Or if you saw it, it would be twisted
Right.
and presented in a different kind of way. Now, what's happening as we speak is that bubble that was just around the MAGA people, where we're starting to see it, is this attempt to make the bubble inclusive of the entire United States. And you're a brave man for having the podcast that you have, but several years from now, we'll see.
Right.
And I've seen this, the way this happened in Russia. So as I mentioned, when I worked in the former Soviet Union, I worked for this nonprofit where we were working with over 300 local TV stations, and they all cropped up out of nowhere. It was really kind of, Russians are ingenious when it comes, like many of them are engineers, and the way they would start TV stations, keep in mind, this was really before the internet and so forth, but the way these guys would start TV stations is they would run a cable from their VCR to the general antenna of a huge housing project, and they figured out how to turn people's cable on and off. So they could say, "Oh, the guy in 10D will be able to get my feed because he's paying me 10 rubles a month." And so they were able to kind of collect these things, and mostly they were just showing pirated crapola that they would get. But then some of them started doing their own programming and local news and stuff like that. And then by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, this was right in the end of Gorbachev. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the broadcast laws were liberalized, and people who had experience in understanding how you do programming actually bought broadcast licenses. So you have this interesting proliferation of really funky, weird TV stations from Vladivostok in the west to Pinsk Vladivostok in the east to Pinsk in the west, and they were doing crazy stuff. But when Putin came in, station by station, they were either shut down, they were audited, they were the aluminum classic example would be like the aluminum factory has underwritten a television station, but the TV station is trying to get some other advertisers so they don't have to be relying on the aluminum factory. Well, Putin makes a call to the aluminum factory and says, you know what, that TV station actually has too much power. Why don't you start putting the squeeze on it and tell them they can't have other advertisers? And piece by piece by piece. And, I always thought that this was a uniquely Russian/Soviet thing. But look at what happened with the Tonight Show or the Late Show.
Yeah.
Where what was going on there, right? Like it was a financial decision. It was that I can't remember, was it Skynet or Sky? There was some
Skydance, I think.
Bought Paramount, right? That was ostensibly they wanted, or the Paramount people wanted that deal to go through, and clearly there was some backdoor negotiation where they said, can we get this guy? I'm blanking on the name of the host.
Steve Colbert.
Yeah. Can we get this Colbert guy off? And clearly that's, to my mind, is what happens.
Yeah.
But it's not Big Brother. Like, 1984 is the wrong template. We may eventually end up with Big Brother in 1984, but the pathway to Big Brother in 1984 is a series of oligarchical deals that shut off the air to free media one by one by one. And I think that's what we're going to, we saw with NPR and PBS. It's not shut down yet. The foundations are rushing in, but now the foundations that are rushing in Now the government can say, oh, look at those we knew the Rockefeller Foundation, we knew the Knight Foundation, we knew they were just pinko Democrats all along, and now they're going to sue those foundations. And that's my prediction for the next year. So it's just a ratcheting down and a ratcheting up of pressure that we're going to see. I think if this year was the year of disruption, hopefully it's just this year, then next year is going to be the ratcheting down of voices that don't conform to this sort of MAGA media bubble. Sorry, again, very long answer to your point. That's where I see things going.
Well, I was actually going to ask you, how do you see your book in the lineage of other political satires like Orwell's 1984 or even Dr. Strangelove?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'd like it to I think when I it's a thin book. I'll hold it up, but I know that most people are video, are not on video, but it's very thin. It's not even as wide as my nose, and it's 100 pages. And to my mind, it was meant to be sort of like common sense in the sense of that it's just something that people could pick up and read and say, huh, you know what, actually, we're going entirely against our ideals at this point. So that's the role I'd like it to play. It is a sort of Emperor's New Clothes moment, hopefully. 1984 has always haunted me, and I always found it to be one of the most depressing, disturbing books. I remember my English teacher did a really funny, interesting thing, because we all came in after reading it, and this was back in the day when actually the assigned book got read by the people in school. But we all read it, and we were all just like in a totally dark mood. And my English teacher said, "What are you talking about? It's a totally optimistic ending." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "Did you read the afterword about Newspeak?" And I'm like, "No, we didn't read it." So in the afterword about Newspeak, it says, "Newspeak was the language adopted by Oceania in such and such a time." In other words, it's in the past. So Oceania doesn't exist anymore. So like it's a historical document. Maybe that's true. I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of take on it. Something that's always been in my mind. Actually, never spoken out loud about it before. But I don't know. I mean, there's another troubling thing that happens as democracies crumble, which is the absurdist parody starts to rise to the surface. There was when I worked in Croatia, so I was head of Balkan medium programs for Internews, and I worked in Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, and each of those countries had their own form of autocracy. You could argue that Bosnia was,
right,
trying its hand at liberalism, but you had Milosevic in Serbia and you had Tudjman in Croatia, and both of them were, autocrats in their own way. And there's a newspaper in Croatia called the Feral Tribune, and it was this highly satirical paper, and they would do things like put and this was before AI and even Photoshop, but they would do these photo mock-ups of Tudjman and Milosevic in bed together, like spooning, and mocking in a very extreme kind of way. And then you have there are a couple of post-Soviet authors who are like that. The name will come to me in a moment. But when news becomes so discredited and the news ecosystem becomes so discredited, then everything turns to a kind of absurd state. And that to me is a real warning signal, because it means that the majority of the people no longer trust what information and news is in the first place.
right.
So I definitely see that starting to happen. I'm thinking of, did you see the famed, much talked about South Park episode recently?
I have not seen it yet, no, but I've obviously heard about it.
Yeah, and I watched it with some friends, and it's like all about Trump's little penis, and he's in bed with Satan, and it's funny, and those of us who've seen South Park over the years recognize a certain kind of ill humor, but it is in that sort of like, things are so out of control that all we can do is poke silly fun at things instead of getting these fucking people in court and suing the shit out of them and getting them out of office. I mean, like that, mockery is very easy, as long as they don't arrest you.
Well, I mean, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things that really annoys me is like Hakeem Jeffries with his strongly worded letters.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I think we might be beyond a letter at this point. How about some action? And I get they're not in power, but it seems as though they ought to be doing something, because this idea, I mean, I'm trying to decide if I think that Trump is going to run for a third term, and I'm kind of leaning towards with you that, yeah, I think is going to. And so the question then becomes, well, how does that happen? And obviously that would, like you said, that would be through the Supreme Court. And I think people might find it a bit absurd, but there are scenarios where, I mean, again, we're in that absurd state as it is. But they could simply start by redefining what elected means.
That's right. That's right. Or the dance that, Milosevic did and Putin did. Milosevic played this game. There were term limits in Serbia, but Serbia was part of a rump Yugoslavia that still existed, even though it was only 2 countries left. Remember, there were like 7 countries in Yugoslavia, but by the time everybody left, it was just Serbia and Montenegro, which Montenegro was basically Serbia's little bitch. So they would just rotate it. And so Milosevic would be president of Serbia, but oh no, he's president of Yugoslavia, but no, he's president of Serbia again. Putin did a similar jog with Medvedev, making him president, and he was prime minister. I can't remember what the exact titles were. I could easily see Trump doing this with one of his children, or one of his functionaries, a puppet vice president who becomes president, and Trump is still kind of pulling the strings.
Right.
But there's a lot of runway between now and 2028 for things to get really fucked up and distorted. So I think really it's all on the table. One of the things, and this is where things have sort of outpaced me as an author, but the reason that I put really focused on the third term as the kind of crux of the issue is that it's like a metaphor for everything that's unconstitutional. It's very clear in the Constitution that you're not supposed to, you can't run, you can't have a third term. But you could say that about everything that has transpired in the last, 6 to 8 months. The other thing that's sort of fun about the third term thing is that keep in mind that the limiting of terms only happened, I think it was 1952 with
56, I think.
it was 56. I can't remember. It's in here somewhere. No, 51 actually. 22nd Amendment.
Right.
No
February
person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice, because it was a direct reaction to Roosevelt running for 4 terms. But up until that time, up until Roosevelt ran for as many terms as he did, it was precedent, and it was set by Washington himself, who willingly stepped down after 2 terms. So I think what's fun about the book and the inherent tension in the book is that Trump, or the tyrant in the book, who just desperately wants a third term, and Washington, in fact, actually doesn't want a third term. He has to be kind of convinced
Right.
to do this. He found being a public person horrible. He found, the fact that he was under scrutiny all the time to be unbearable. He desperately just wanted to rest. I mean, say what you will about Washington as a slave owner, but he was freaking in the field fighting wars, doing, even after he had left office, Hamilton convinced him to get back up on the darn horse during the Whiskey Rebellion, and make a show of force when, I think in Pennsylvania, when a bunch of drunks tried to kind of basically, resist the will of the federal government. So he'd had his fill. And I think that is meant to be kind of the pivot of the book, is that, a wise man of character, a wise person of character understands that power is something that is a pleasure to walk away from, whereas the unwise egomaniac only wants to accrue more and sees no end to that once it's begun. It's very much true of the Power Broker, the Robert Caro book I was talking about, and he sort of plots it out in Robert Moses's arc. But yeah, so what will happen, I don't know. But I think that there are many feints and dodges to the left and right. But meanwhile, we're losing pawns, and it reminds me a lot of a game of chess. Like I'm not a great chess player. My son is quite good, but you start by picking away at the pawns, and then maybe you grab a rook, and then before you know it, your queen is boxed in, and you have nothing left in your arsenal. So I think we're losing pawns right now, and maybe a rook or two. But by 2028, who's going to be who's going to be on our chessboard?
Yeah. Well, exactly. And that's my concern, is who are the Democrats going to put up? Are we going to have, well, the question at this point is, are we even going to have fair elections? I mean,
Right.
if we just heard, was it yesterday or on Friday, Trump talking about, oh, Putin talked to me and mail-in voting. I'm going to pass an executive order that outlaws mail-in voting.
That's
Again, unconstitutional. But what I like to tell people is, forget about constitutional. The Constitution is a piece of paper.
That's right.
It's what the people in power decide they're going to abide by. And if the Supreme Court says, no, you know what, this executive order is perfectly fine. So it's obvious that Trump is trying to interfere in the election. It's been a strategy of his from day one.
Absolutely. No, politics is, as they say, is the art of the possible. Yeah. And all constitutions are frameworks, are agreed upon frameworks that we hope everyone's going to act within. Right. The Soviets famously don't abide by those kinds of things and never did. You look at like the Hitler-Stalin Pact and just everything, arms treaties and negotiations, the Soviets, regularly violated those kinds of things because it's not a society of rules and order.
Right.
It's a society of power. So once we lose the consensus that the framework is what we all agree upon, then it, as you say, it's a piece of paper. So yeah, I mean, and Hakeem Jeffries with his letters. I was actually, so I live in New York, and like any good Jew, I go to Chinese food on Christmas Eve, and actually go Christmas caroling with friends, and then we always go to the Peking Duck House in Chinatown. And who should we see there but Chuck Schumer? And he was there, and he was like, "Hi, nice to see you." He's like, "I'd shake your hand, but I got hoisin sauce on my hand." And and I was just looking at this guy. He looks so old. He looks so frail. Even though he's actually, compared to some of the dinosaurs in Congress, I think he's only like mid 70s, a youngin compared to others. But I just felt like, I was looking at a real career politician whose focus wasn't really on justice or his constituents even, but it was just in, staying in power. So whoever's coming up is going to have to really think about, am I in this as a career, or am I in this, for right and justice? I'm curious, have you been following this, our Mamdani candidate over here? Has that been in your field of vision?
It has. I have not interviewed anybody from his campaign yet. We're working on that. But I'm fascinated by Mamdani.
Me too.
I think that, again, he's redefining. Well, he understands politics. He understands the media. He understands, talking to the people and delivering. I mean, do I think he's going to accomplish all of his goals if he's elected? I think he's going to run into a lot of resistance, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
But the fact is, he's proposing new solutions. He's addressing the fact there are problems, affordability, right? And that's what I want to see Democrats doing. And it's very disheartening to see the Democratic Party attacking him or refusing to endorse him.
Horrible. I agree. Yeah. And, look, I'm Jewish, and I, certainly part of my hackles went up a little bit, over the sort of like global intifada kind of thing. But at a certain point, how many times does he have to kind of swear allegiance that he's, he's a liberal guy and, open to all parties? And, there's nothing in his resume to suggest in any way that he's, anti-Semitic or whatever. And that's another cudgel that's pretty interestingly being, leveled by this administration, is the whole kind of anti-Semitism thing. I don't necessarily need to go into that too much, but going back to Mamdani, he is fast on his feet. He is of a different generation. My son is so for him. My son's 18. So for him, to the point where like he wanted to. He goes to school in at McGill, and he's like, how can I vote from there? Like he's real. Like I've never seen him so fired up about politics in my life, and I never, I think young people feel spoken to for the first time.
Yes.
And it'd just be so great to kind of just remove the gerontocracy from our government entirely. I'm 58. I don't need to be in power, and I would hope that whatever. Let's top it at 60. How about so I could get a couple years in if I wanted to, but I just don't see the reason to have these ancient people running government, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. It's just, I was furious with Biden for staying in the race, and, I've been, reading excerpts of Jake Tapper's book, the CNN correspondent, about just the horrible, horrible maneuvers that were made to kind of conceal his age and so forth. And I just feel like if there could be this rising up of youth. I remember my brother was super into comic books as a kid, and he would always buy sort of all sorts of weird comic books that he'd find in the shop. And one of them was called Prez, and it was about an 18-year-old who gets elected president. and that's always been on my mind. Where's my Prez? Where's my young guy to kind of, make some young mistakes, but also bring young energy into the whole thing. I think, look at how, obviously Obama did not do what we had hoped he would do. He was very much, part of that system that you described in your opener, but his youth and his freshness was something, and it was inspiring just by virtue of itself. So if we could only have some of that, that would be really nice.
Well, Mondani reminds me a lot of Bernie Sanders.
True, but he's 50 years younger, 40 years younger. And, it's like, I mean, I guess it'd be interesting to know what Bernie is up to. He's obviously backing AOC, he's backing Mondani, and he's doing these kinds of things. I wonder if maybe he could step back a little more, and not be visible. You know what I mean? I think the power of the crowd, or the intoxication of the crowd, is intoxicating, and especially as you get older, and I even feel it at my relatively youthful age, that you get marginalized the older you get, and to have crowds and crowds and crowds chanting your name, I think can delude you into thinking that you're the person of the moment. So I don't know. I think I always go back to something I was thinking, that when Biden didn't step down, that if he had stepped down, then he kept saying, Kamala kept saying, we're turning the page on all this. And she couldn't turn it because there was like a paperweight on the page. If Biden had stepped down, I really truly think we would have thought of Trump as the past. And there might have been some stirring both in the Republican pot and the Democratic pot, but it didn't happen. And I just think, there's a narcissism to the generation, to the baby boomer generation. And again, I don't want to get into generational divide, I think, is another manufactured product of the, military industrial complex. But I will say that I think just by sheer demographics, the boomers have had this feeling that they're in charge and that they should stay in charge. I see this in academia. Like I'm an adjunct at NYU, and I see professors hanging on and still teaching when really they should move on and let younger people take the reins. And it's stultifying. It's asphyxiating. And I don't know. I don't know if the Buddha felt this, that he should step down. I guess he sat down. But I think, finding selflessness in old age seems to be a challenge for the present generation.
Yeah, well, I just interviewed the author of a book a couple weeks ago about the generational gap, millennials, and talking about the stress that they're under. And he mentioned the fact that the boomers are still in charge, and that's a problem.
Yep. I'm sure he talked about it, but there's this generational wealth transfer that's not happening. It's not. It's
Right.
it's staying ensconced in these 401ks, and it's it's just like so many boomers I know just love to tell me how much money is in their 401k and how smart they were to stay the course and stay invested in equities and da 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 da. And meanwhile, younger people can't even put away $20 to put into their retirement savings, and it's just at what point do you call that? I think the boomers like to pat themselves on the back for how smart they were for navigating the system and ending up in their lives relatively wealthy, but they don't understand that it was a different system, that everything from the GI Bill to cheap college enabled them to assemble the war chest that they assembled, and it's just that same war chest is not available to younger people, and that younger people and then take it on the chin for being slackers or lazy or whatever, wanting quality of life and stuff like that. But, if their opportunities are not open to them, why should they buy into this so-called American dream?
Yeah. Before we run out of time, I want to play, if it's okay with you, a clip from your audiobook.
Sure, please do.
If I can get Mackenzie to pop that up there. And we can put the cover back, too.
George Washington stood in the wings of Madison Square Garden and arranged his sash. There had been much fussing over how he would present himself to the New York crowd, and even some debate over whether or not the delegates would even recognize him. Any live person differs from his portrait, even in photography. The same was true of Washington. His face was decidedly more animated than the later portraits suggested. To complicate matters further, the improvements modern medicine had made upon him were notable. To begin with, his lingering pneumonia had been treated with antibiotics, and good color had returned to his complexion. A pustule in his thigh, which had 3 times during his first term broken out into a nearly fatal condition, had been removed, and this long-standing affliction, which had strained his expression every day of his life, was now gone. But by far the most noted improvement concerned the general's mouth. Over the course of his years, first as general and later as president, Washington had enlisted the services of 2 dentists whom he'd taken into his greatest confidence, all for the purpose of addressing his deteriorating dental condition. In the end, only a single bicuspid of his original teeth remained, and this tooth had been tortured cruelly, made to anchor a set of dentures fashioned from other human teeth implanted in hippopotamus bone, which were in turn enabled to open and close through the intervention of a gold spring. This, to the dentists of 2028, was a work of steampunk. So gruesome and yet so ingenious was its design that they photographed it with their phones and saved the pictures for a time when it would be permitted to discuss their illustrious patient. Removing the last bicuspid, which was quite rotten by this point, the rehabilitation team had spared no expense fitting the general with a set of implants that matched perfectly his jawline and restored what would have been his natural profile. So much so that when the dentists finally finished, Washington's famously jutting lower jaw jutted no more. Nearly every day that he woke and felt no oral pain, Washington dropped to his knees and thanked the Creator tearfully. In the final years of his former life, Washington had been known for the stilted qualities of his speech, but no one had really known how much of this reticence had stemmed from the issue that the simple act of moving his jaws was profoundly painful. Sibilant sounds, the lovely s's, sh's, and zh's, were particularly hard to enunciate, and he had by the end of his second term come to excise whole lexicons from his public discourse to avoid the most troublesome consonant clusters. Now, in the wings of the garden, he felt that reticence lift. He could say literally anything he wanted without fear of his teeth falling out, or of aspirating a word he wished to use as a steady anchor for the next sentence. He felt, in short, nearly the same as he felt when addressing his troops when he first took up a battlefield commission against the French in '54. When the curtain parted, he heard the old fife and drum music played over a loudspeaker, and then strode to the center of the stage, remembering his blocking precisely, giving the profile that would be the most recognizable to the majority of latter-day Americans. Laughter punctuated the arena on one side, the crowd sensing perhaps a late-night comedian brought out to lighten the atmosphere. But on another side of the arena, a gasp went out, and then all at once, applause rippled across the venue as Washington moved closer to the edge of the stage, smiled a broad smile with his new dentures, and began his address. "My friends, my good fellow citizens, my brethren in love of liberty, it is no less a surprise that I find myself here than you would have found in presupposing my presence. I have come hence tonight, at the behest of this democratic faction, to intervene at a moment of tyranny. Those that preside over this faction saw fit to summon me from the mansions of rest, so that I might impartially, and without want of personal gain, guide you through this particular storm toward a safer shore. That, at least, was the hope presented to me." Here, Washington paused and looked through the stage lights at the 20,000-odd delegates and hangers-on that had gathered to anoint a nominee. There was a rapt, puzzled silence.
I think that's the end.
I love the narration. Is the audiobook available now for sale?
Yes. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah, you can get it on Amazon, and actually Spotify. It's all over all these different platforms. Yeah, that actor is a friend of mine named Bray Poor, who has been everywhere. He's one of those actors that you know, but you don't know. He was on The Sopranos. He's on all kinds of shows.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And, like many of us is, changing careers. And he actually was a Tony nominated sound designer on Broadway and now is getting into audiobooks. So I thought we'd give it a shot together. But yeah, no, I really, it's funny. I really enjoy listening to that passage because I don't know, writing is mysterious and sometimes you feel you're just plodding along. And other times I've been saying, to people when they ask me about it, it's like, most of the writing I've done has been really hard and taken long times of just plodding along. But this time I really felt voices in my head speaking to me. You hear of writers talking about that. I'd never experienced that in my life, but this time I really felt it. And, and then when you listen to that voice, the metaphorical resonances come to you later and you realize what the book is a lot about is about Washington actually finding out what's really on his mind and what's really eating him. And it turns out, one of those issues is slavery, and it comes up later in the book. But the teeth that were implanted in Washington's jaws back in the 1700s were slaves' teeth that had literally been pulled out of living humans and put into his own jaw. So we find that out later. Of course, also it's very guided by real things like authors are. I always writing is like a dirty snowball. It's just like, you roll down a hill and it picks up crap along the way. But like my stepmother has had so much dental work over the years and she's like, oh, I'm going to Kenny again. He's going to do this bridge work and da, 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 da. But I also thinking about like, I've had, teeth extracted and so forth. And when the pain is gone, it's such a miraculous kind of thing. And, to think about Washington in total horrible pain all the time, having to give speeches and things like that, where literally his teeth could fall out of his mouth in an incredible moment. And Washington was super vain too. So like to have
Right.
that, forever on that. So, again, that's another metaphor. America is super vain. We don't want to show our slip coming up. We don't want to show our bad side. But as as you were saying earlier, it's like, unless you confront your defects, you're never going to, get closer to that perfection that you so hope for.
Yeah.
It's like a big comb over.
What I found, and it's interesting that that's the clip that we had to play, is I have a bone disease.
Oh,
so I actually lost all of my teeth. I've got dentures.
Oh, interesting.
And so I totally related to that as I was reading it. I'm like, oh my God, that's so on point.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible Washington had something similar, right? Because it was very early in his life that he lost his teeth or that the teeth started to fail. Yeah, I mean, I think for any of us who've ever been in any kind of pain can be so central, to your life. I just had both of my hips replaced actually this year, and it's a miraculous. It's a miracle. I can swim, I can bike, I can run. But getting back to real issue here, right, is that a lot of America is in pain. actual pain.
Real
And,
pain. Yes.
huge portion of America is actually in pain. And you talk about, whatever the epidemic of painkillers. I'm blanking on the name of the painkiller, but yeah, and no, it's not an epidemic of painkiller addiction. It's an epidemic of pain because people aren't getting, as you said, the medical care that they need, the early intervention that they need. So, you can blame people on being weak-willed and so forth, but people are actually in pain. Pain is, man, it's like, it's all encompassing. And if that's what, I always think about, have you ever been to like a PT or where they give you the pain levels, and
Oh,
they just, one, I barely notice it sometimes. Two, it bothers me sometimes. Three, it's on my mind, but I can do most tasks. Four, I can't do a lot of tasks. And then when it's up around an 8, it's like I think about my pain all the time and I can't do anything. Yeah. And I think a lot of America is like that, And so again, it anticipates the fatalism of voters, right? If you're that miserable, fuck it. I'm just in horrible pain. Maybe this guy will make everyone else in pain.
Well, no, and you know what? I think you just hit upon things right there. A lot of, I think, the support for Trump is people. I mean, first off, Trump again ran as a populist, so he went to people who are in pain, and he said, "I acknowledge that you're pain.
Yep.
And the pain that you're suffering is caused from these folks over here. Elect me, and I can fix that."
Yep.
And a lot of people also, I think, felt that Trump was like a wrecking ball. And they're like, we're tired of this system that has not worked for us. To hell with it. Let them just knock the whole fucking thing down and see what happens. And I think a lot of people are finding out that that's not such a great a great concept in real life. But
well, it's like a sweater. You pull a thread and the whole sweater falls apart.
Yeah.
But again, if you're in horrible pain, you can do one of two things. You can hope that somebody will fix your pain, or you can hope that pain will be inflicted on others so that they suffer the way that you're suffering. And I think it fits the bill either way.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, especially listening to that clip, you're such a brilliant writer.
Oh, thank you.
By the way, how did you balance historical authenticity with fictional reasons to write the character of George Washington?
Yeah, there's so my brother's a screenwriter, and we talk a lot about, he writes like horror and science fiction stuff, and he always talks about how the science doesn't necessarily have to be real science; it just has to be believable science. Right. Everyone knows that if you really talk to scientists, Jurassic Park is impossible. The DNA in the little amethyst is not going to have survived.
Wait a minute, are you telling me that's not possible?
It's not possible. It's not possible. So when you go into sort of old timey language, there is a world. There's a I want to say almost liturgical space. There's a syntactical space that the reader perceives as old and old timey and not of my era. But if you go too authentic, it's not intelligible. Right. And when I was reading Washington's letters and so forth, there's a lot of stuff it wouldn't play. So you find yourself, this is where the voice in my head kind of came in. It's like, I would check things against historical parlances. I use the word feign. I would feign hope that this democracy would persist, things like that. But you can only throw in so much difficulty into any sentence, both for readers and also for listeners. So you have to be kind of parsimonious. Like it's again back to semiotics. It's like you want to suggest the past, but you don't want to necessarily 100% mimic the past. So that was fun. That was a lot of fun. Actually, this is an area where I don't love to talk about technology and stuff. I am the author of this book called Goodbye Phone, Hello World, which is all about quitting your iPhone. And in fact, I do use a flip phone. I'm holding up my Quit Your Phone book on my flip phone. But this is an area where AI has been a little bit effective, where I'll ask it, am I rendering this piece of old Revolutionary War English correctly? And keep in mind, I didn't have this at my disposal when I wrote the first draft in 2020, but when I was doing my revise, it turned out I had slightly misused Feign, and it corrected it. And, obviously, anytime you use AI, you have to check the references and make sure it's not bullshitting you, because it often is bullshitting you. But that was part of it. And then, I think a lot of the energy also came out of, Washington himself was a very evasive person, right? He didn't like to get pinned down, and he used florid language to avoid some of the harder things that were on his plate. So that was another way of, dancing around an issue with an elaborate sentence that actually doesn't confront the thing that you don't want to confront. So, that was part of it. It was also very freeing for me. You see behind me a lot of books that I've written over the years. Four Fish is by far my most popular book. It's taught in universities everywhere, and it's an environmental treatise about the way the ocean is getting screwed up. But it's a format, right? It's a way of writing, and it's kind of got a New York Times voice or a New Yorker voice, and it's just so freeing to change genres and move into something else. It's not always profitable because you get people want from me is, when's your next fish book coming out? And I've written 3 of them, and I might write another one. But it's very freeing to be able to kind of play around with things and be outside of your wheelhouse, your normal wheelhouse. And I think if you don't do that, you can become a horrible imitation of yourself after a while.
Yeah. And I want to give people your website address. It's paulgreenberg.org. That's paulgreenberg.org. And what can people find on your website?
Well, and first of all, I always point out Greenberg, it's green like the color BERG. Some people BURG and iceberg it. But on my website, you'll find links to all my books, all of my journalism, a little bit about my personal digital policy if you're looking to give up your phone. Some links. I did a PBS Frontline called The Fish on My Plate. I have a TED Talk up there. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I've not gone down the well, actually, I did have a podcast at one point called Fish Talk. There you go. I do what I'm paid for. But I never haven't really gone down like the Substack route. It seems like a very crowded field at this point. So I've remained somewhat dedicated to my legacy media. It's where I was educated in how to be a journalist and how to be a writer. So anyway, all those links are still up, and I check them pretty regularly to make sure that they're live and quaking. So yeah, and I do try to update things as they come in. I think my most recent piece was how to be a climate conscious meat eater, and it was for Southern Foodways magazine. I think it's called I'll Have the Chicken, which is basically about how chicken, when you look at all things considered with all the meats that you could eat, chicken's pretty carbon efficient.
Really?
Yes. That's another conversation that would be, if we want to talk about the climate, we can talk about the climate diet. I'd be happy to come back, which is a whole other can of worms. But time passes on, so we probably have to move on today.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you so much. I've had a great conversation. Love the book. Let's put the book cover back up again. A Third Term by Paul Greenberg. And this book, again, there's some twists and turns in it that we're not going to get into, but please pick up a copy of the book, visit Paul's website, check him out. And Paul, again, love to have you back. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been my pleasure. And, it's really nice to kind of go very deeply into something that you spent a lot of time writing with a lot of respect and a lot of interest on your part. So I really appreciate the time.
Yes, no problem. Okay, this has been Coup Save America. We will see you guys next week.